This is Western Civilization 1. I'm Dr. John Young, your instructor. Today we're going to be talking about prehistory. That is the time before written records. History begins properly with written records. The volume of what is known with the advent of written records goes up considerably. And so there's this very important moment in history, this point in time, when written records come into being, and that's what the historian or the student of history is able to access at a much greater level than the sorts of evidence that appeared before that. But that doesn't mean that human beings only began to exist around 4000 BCE or so. Rather, humans lived for a very, very long time. Different evidence pushes the origins of Homo sapiens back as several 100,000 years, perhaps as many as more 500,000 years or more. Before that, of course, we have other hominid species, which evolved eventually into Homo sapiens, which becomes the dominant one. That's not the part of the geological history that I want to get into here. Rather, I want to talk about the last few tens of thousands of years, because we do have evidence from as far back as 25 or 30,000 years ago that's really quite compelling. Here's an example. Now, the caption on the slide here says Paleolithic Era. Paleolithic means old stone or old stone age. And what we can say about this is that people, human beings, crafted tools and other objects that they found useful out of stone. They developed languages. They developed social forms of social organization, what you might even call government. But for the most part, people were living in hunting and gathering groups. And worldwide, in fact, one of the things that we should note is that we, as a species, were hunter-gatherers. That was our primary means of obtaining food and eking out an existence. We were hunter-gatherers for far longer than we have not been hunter-gatherers. In fact, exponentially longer. It's really only the last 10,000 years or so that we decided to do something else. And so in order to account for the past of the human species, we have to try to get at what people did in the Paleolithic era. This statuette really, this thing is only 5 or 6 inches tall, is called the Venus of Willendorf. Discovered in Europe, in Germany or Austria, I forget, and has been dated to about, well, more than 20,000 BCE. And so one of the questions that we should ask ourselves is, what does this mean? Why did hunter-gatherers living in that area craft this, well, what's obviously a female figurine out of stone? Why did they take their time, devote their effort to doing this? Moreover, why did they include the features that you see here? So obviously this is a corpulent woman. She has pronounced breasts and belly region. Also the genitals are visible, the hips and things like that. And so why did a group of hunter-gatherers produce something like this? And really here we can only speculate on a number of possibilities. One is that this was some sort of religious totem or religious icon representing probably fertility. And in fact, from what we can detect from the available evidence, the earliest forms of religion were fertility cults. That is, celebrating or venerating or praying to, beseeching might be the good word there, beseeching some god or goddess that would bring rain and produce crops. And so this may be a fertility icon, and in fact From what we can detect, most of these early fertility cults were female-centered, and if there was a kind of personification of the deity, it tended to be a female figure. So that is a possibility, but this is a very, very early thing, and so it's uncertain if that's what's going on. The other thing that we can say, I think, with a lot of confidence about this is that it represents ideals. This is not reality. It is highly unlikely, for obvious reasons, that women who participated in the acts of hunting and gathering and spent their lives trying to eke out an existence by digging up roots, finding berry bushes, and trying to bring down wild game, probably did not look like this. Now, it is possible, I suppose, given genetic predisposition and things like that, that somebody could have. But I think that this is more an expression of an ideal. So the next question is, why would hunter-gatherers idealize this? What values or ideals, standards of perfection, that is, did this represent? Well, considering that hunter-gatherers spent most of their time trying to survive, to find food so that they could, live another day or week or month, however long the food source lasted, so they could produce children and produce nourishment for those children, so that their group could survive beyond the current generation. A woman who looked like this had enough to eat. Or a woman who would have looked like this even in conception or in theory would have had enough to eat, and obviously from the size of the breasts and other things would have been able to, and the hips and genitals would have been able to bear children without much trouble and to give them plenty of nourishment in the form of breast milk. So whatever this is, whether this is a kind of religious fertility icon or just a kind of artistic expression of an ideal, it's a very powerful witness to the lives of these hunter-gatherers. One of the things that we should say is that even though there probably were some demarcations between the gender roles, men probably were the primary hunters and women the primary gatherers, everyone, men, women, and children, probably even the elderly, were involved in the search for food. And that might seem like a really terrible way to live. I'm not sure that there's anyone in a modern, especially Western sedentary society, who would probably sign up to be a hunter-gatherer. However, it's not as bad from studies that have been done of modern groups who continue to persist in this lifestyle. The San people of southern Africa, some groups, relatively uncontacted groups in the Amazon rainforest and other places. The hunting and gathering life is not as, well, it's different than one might expect. For one, hunter-gatherers probably only worked maybe 10 or 15 hours a week. In other words, they worked far less than people did after the advent of agriculture, and certainly than people do today, probably. Now, why is that the case? Well, if they found a source of food and were able to process that food, as it were, that is, skin the animal, cut the meat off, dry it or smoke it or something like that, find some roots and cut them up or pound them into some edible form, grind them in some way, then their work was done for as long as that food lasted. Now, the labor was probably intense. The chasing of wild game, the digging up of roots, the pounding or grinding of the plant food sources would have been a laborious task, yes. But hunter-gatherers seem to have a good deal of time left over for things like, well, singing, dancing. There are various forms of performance art that have been detected among hunting and gathering groups, and producing art like this, or like the famous cave paintings of Chauvet, France, and other places. And so really hunter-gatherer life was probably more complex than we might be inclined to give them credit for. Now, around 10,000 years ago or so, and it didn't happen everywhere at once, and it never really made it until much later to some parts of the world, but human beings went through a massive revolution. We call this either the Neolithic Revolution because we demarcate periods here, referring to this as the New Stone Age or the Neolithic Age, as opposed to the Paleolithic or Old Stone Age. But this was a massive shift from hunting and gathering to planting and herding, with the domestication of plants and animals as the central feature. Now, this is arguably the most significant revolution in all of the history of human existence. It changed the way that human beings live more than any other mass movement that we as a species have participated in. There is only one exception, I think, to that, one possible contender, and that would be the technological revolution that has been happening over the last few decades and which has been transforming life in ways that are profound and I think irrevocable. We are now tied to our devices. We are cut off from each other, often in real contact, and prefer to spend our lives communicating, interacting with each other virtually via social media and other things. And that seems to be the direction we're going. We are even trying to sort of merge the machines with our organic human matter, first in the form of wearables and also, I think, only medically and other things at this point, but probably by choice later on, to actually integrate or create a human-machine hybrid. But that's the stuff of science fiction at this point. It's very interesting, and so we might contemplate, as we look back at this very old revolution, the revolution that we're currently undergoing. Now, one of the things that we should point out here is that this was a varied revolution. Some human societies turned from hunting and gathering to planting crops and harvesting those crops as their primary means of food. Other human groups turned from hunting and gathering to herding domesticated animals as their primary activity for survival. And that distinction is important. Not all groups were agriculturalists, some were pastoralists. In fact, the term nomad, which tends to be confused with hunter-gatherer, actually means pastoralists. And so there were a number of nomadic societies, and these nomadic societies have exerted a profound influence on history, really up until fairly recent times. Nomadic groups tend to be more warlike than their neighboring agricultural societies, and thus have an easier time defeating and conquering those agricultural societies. But then they tend to get assimilated once they have conquered those societies. And this is an important way of thinking about the interaction between agriculturalists and pastoralists. We can identify a number of pastoral groups that have been around for a very long time: the Berbers of North Africa, or the various horse nomads of Central Asia, and there are a number of manifestations of those. The various Turkish people, the Magyars, a group we'll talk about later. The Huns, another group we'll talk about later on in the course. The Mongols, many of these are quite famous. Gone down in lore via Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure or some other great historical film, right? I say that a little tongue-in-cheek. But these horse nomads of Central Asia were really important for some of the civilizations of the surrounding regions. Cattle nomads in sub-Saharan Africa, nomads tend to be identified by the primary animal they rely on. The Berbers or the Bedouins in the Middle East would have for them it would have been the camel. For the Turks, the Huns, or the Magyars, or the Mongols in Central Asia, it would have been the horse. For the various Bantu groups in southern Africa, it would have been the cow. And so, we need to acknowledge that Nomadic groups have their own complexity, right? But let's focus now on the agriculturalists. The move to agriculture brought about a profound change in the way human beings organize themselves, the way they live, the way they view the world. And we should account for some of those changes. Now, first maybe we could talk about some consistencies. Humans still, for many centuries after discovering agriculture, continued to make tools out of stone. However, these tools did change in nature, whereas previous to this time in the Paleolithic era, most tools that we can find, at least, are for hunting or digging. Either digging sticks or arrowheads or spearheads or something like that. After the Neolithic Revolution gets underway, we find stone tools like the one you see pictured here on the slide. This is a grinding stone for the grinding of grain into flour. I cannot imagine trying to do this. I have ground wheat by hand using a fancy hand grinder before, and even that efficient machine took quite a long time. I can't imagine trying to basically use two pieces of stone to create flour, but this shows you how labor intensive this could be. And in fact, that's one of the important changes that human societies underwent, is they started to work a lot harder. In fact, devote their lives primarily to work. And because there was so much labor necessary, and people were reluctant to do that, we tend to see forms of coercion. Human societies have tended, and starting with the Neolithic Revolution, tended to break into hierarchies, and the people at the bottom have almost invariably been the farmers, the ones who have done the manual labor. Those who are at the top participate in other activities, governing, judging, leading forms of belief, in other words, the religious leaders, and maybe most importantly, fighting. Here's another example of a tool, a harvester's sickle, from roughly 3000 BCE in the Fertile Crescent. And so you can see those tools. But, the tools even would have been varied between different kinds of people. Now, we talked about specialization. Let's explore that a little bit further. This is another of the consequences of the Neolithic Revolution, that humans began to differentiate themselves not only in terms of kind of hierarchy or what we might call class, but also in the activities they performed, because not all people could perform all activities equally. Someone who was really good, say, at making sickles, what you see here, and if you don't know what this is a tool for cutting the grain stalks. So, somebody who's really good at this, who can put a really good edge onto that stone, probably would have been in high demand, and more than just making sickles for himself or herself, he or she would have probably been asked, maybe with some sort of bartering arrangement, to make sickles for other people. Because, this is the best sickle maker after all, and everyone else wants that quality of sickle, and so the sickle maker, the highly skilled sickle maker, can thus specialize in making sickles. Now, some of the other consequences that go along with this. Because humans became very reliant, almost entirely reliant on agriculture, the most important commodity for them was land. Now, in some parts of the world, this was not a huge problem because the populations never really maxed out the available fertile land. But in other places, and in particular the societies that we're going to look at a little bit later here, in the Fertile Crescent in Egypt, land was scarce. I don't mean really scarce, like it's a commodity that you can't find anywhere. What I mean is that there was not necessarily enough to go around. And it was, not all land was equal in growing certain crops. Some land was probably better for grain, others maybe for other commodities, maybe olive oil or something like that, depending largely on the amount of available water. Some crops need more water than others. So the land next to a river, and I mean right next to the river, would have been more valuable probably, than the land a couple of miles away from the river, because the water is just that much easier to get to the land. I guess unless that land was really swampy, in which case it probably wouldn't be as valuable. But all of this is to say that land was produced an inequality. Now, we could launch into a discussion of the great philosophers of the Enlightenment period and talking about the state of nature and inequality and things like this, the origins of inequality, but we'll resist that. And instead simply say that people were unequal, right? That the best land was in high demand. Now, if two people or two groups of people happen to claim the same piece of land, then we see conflict. And in fact, the advent of warfare was one of the major repercussions of the move from hunting and gathering to agriculture. But conflict is not the only means of solving these inequalities. Human beings also came up with the notion that they could trade things. If I, say, live on a piece of land that is drier but is sufficient, in fact really good, for viticulture, specifically olive trees or something like that, and you live on a land that's really good for growing grain, well, I might want to fight with you to take over your land that's good for growing grain, because I might want to get in on that activity too. But I can also, another option might be that I take some of my olive oil that I've produced and trade it with you for some of your grain, right? Now, warfare and trade sometimes even happened at the same time. People who were fighting sometimes engaged in trade, even puzzlingly in commodities that would have given their enemies an advantage in warfare. And this extends into the modern period, by the way. One really well-documented case of this is that in the First World War, the British Army was desperately in need of field glasses, binoculars we would call them. And as it turned out, the best binocular makers in Europe at the time were German firms. And so the British Army got in touch with these German firms who agreed to sell these field glasses to the British Army, and in fact canceled some contracts with the German army. Now you might say, okay, why did they do that? England and Germany were at war with each other. Well, the desire to make a profit sometimes contravenes the desire to win a war, or to be effective in fighting a war. So warfare and or trade, or maybe both of those simultaneously. Now, another consequence that we should account for here is what happens to women. We noted in the brief discussion we had a few minutes ago about the Neolithic Revolution, or rather the Paleolithic period, the hunting and gathering period, that women and men both participated in the essential activities of their societies, that women were probably the founders of the earliest religious cults, that women were, I don't want to use the word equal, but they were yoked together with the men in fundamental ways. And I think that did continue to happen, but women's activities tended to change with the Neolithic Revolution. And women tended to be denigrated to a subordinate position in Neolithic societies. Why did this happen? Well, primarily because, generally speaking, men were biologically stronger than women. Again, that's speaking collectively and not individually, but biologically stronger, and thus did the bulk of the fighting, just as they had done the bulk of the hunting before the Neolithic Revolution. Women still probably did a lot of the farming, just as they had done a lot of the gathering, but these activities were put into a hierarchy in these societies, with fighting at the very top, or very near the top. In fact, in many of these early societies, and really this is the case all the way into the early modern era, just a few hundred years ago, Warriors also tended to be the governing class of the various societies. There was a close association between governmental control and fighting wars. So that's another consequence. Now, on the whole, I think we would view this as a positive step forward, the creation of sedentary societies, and in fact, this is another of the chief features of the Neolithic Revolution, that rather than the small groups of hunter-gatherers, maybe 20 to at most 100 people, we now have, with the Neolithic Revolution, by about 3000 BCE or so, settlements that reach around 100,000 in population, astronomically larger than anything that had existed up to that point in terms of social organization. How was that possible? Well, obviously you need regulation, you need some sort of coordination. In other words, you need government and laws and things like this to allow for society to function smoothly with that level of population. But there were some definite negatives here. For one, becoming reliant primarily on grain, plant products, as the main source of food meant that the diet of most human beings became far less varied than it had been when we were hunting and gathering. Hunter-gatherers tend to eat whatever they can find. It's often a tremendously varied diet, whereas farmers tend to eat, well, whatever the main staple crop is, primarily supplemented with a few things that they might or might not have at certain seasons of the year. Moreover, most human beings, the general human constitution, does not assimilate grain crops as easily as it does some other foods, and so some of the chronic diseases that have plagued human beings ever since then, probably things like some forms of cancer, certainly things like heart disease and diabetes and things like this, are an unintended and somewhat indirect but still important consequence of the move to agriculture. Another one, as we noted, is that humans tended to work a lot harder. And so there were some trade-offs here to this. The creation of these hierarchical societies with people, peasants, that is farmers, women, finding themselves oppressed. But on the other hand, human societies were able to become larger and vastly more complex than they had been while we were hunting and gathering. By about the 4th millennium BCE, we have these highly developed societies in a couple of parts of the world, and in the millennium or so after that in other parts of the world. So we're not going to talk about the civilization of the Indus River Valley, for instance, here, which shows up by about 3000 BCE, or the Yellow River Valley in China, which is maybe 2000 to maybe 2500 BCE, or even the Olmec civilization of Central America, which is, the latter part of the 3rd millennium BCE. So all of these are areas that saw large-scale civilization like this. The two that we're going to discuss, and arguably the two oldest civilizations in human history, are the Fertile Crescent, otherwise known as Mesopotamia. You can see why it's called the Fertile Crescent here. It runs from the southern part of this region called Palestine or Israel up through Phoenicia here on the Mediterranean coast, and then down these two rivers, the Euphrates on the west and the Tigris on the east. The word Mesopotamia in Greek means the land between two rivers. This was the site of a very important ancient civilization. However, one of the things we should note a few things about Mesopotamia. Okay, first of all, the lifeblood of the civilization is the rivers. They supplied the water that was necessary for the growing of the food. They also supplied the main means of transport from one part of the region to another. But the character of these rivers went a long way to determining what the civilization that grew up there looked like. These rivers are unpredictable. Particularly the Euphrates, though the Tigris in parts is also. Unpredictable in that they flooded a lot. at times that could not be anticipated. To the north, up here in the Caucasus region, between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, and so just off of the map here, are mountains that at certain times of the year get heavy snowfall, but tend also to see sudden periods of warmth, and thus the snow melts, and they send raging floods down the rivers to dump into the Persian Gulf. And at parts of the Euphrates, the river has these natural levees that is created over hundreds of thousands of years. And the river, like the Mississippi around New Orleans, sits above the land around it. Well, if one of these floods comes, much as we saw with Hurricane Katrina in 2005, the levees can get breached and the whole surrounding land floods. Well, this was a fairly common occurrence, and they could not predict when it might happen. Now, if the people of Mesopotamia lived constantly in the fear of floods, you might detect and surmise, and you'd be correct about this, that they would be fearful, that they would be pessimistic about their prospects. We might equate this to, I live in Florida, we live in Florida, it gets really, really hot here, and if we have, for instance, say the month of June or something like that is rather cool and it never gets above, say, 85 degrees, well, the tendency of a person from Florida would be to say, well, July is going to be really, really terrible, right? I'm sure that that horribly hot weather is just around the corner, and this is not just for hot places. People who live in, say, Minnesota or something like that, if they have a fairly mild winter, their predictable response is going to be, well, next year is really going to be awful. We're going to get snowed in every week next year. Okay. Well, we might liken that to the situation in Mesopotamia. If there hadn't been a flood for some time, then they were certainly fearful that it was going to come, that a respite really wasn't a relief necessarily from this. Now, there's another thing that we should note about the civilization that grew up here, besides its pessimism from having these unpredictable raging rivers. And that is that there are no really good natural boundaries that divide one part of Mesopotamia from another. The rivers themselves lend themselves to easy transportation. From the upper Tigris up here in this region called Assyria, say down to Sumer, it wasn't difficult to travel, which meant trade on the one hand between the different city-states that developed in Mesopotamia, but also conflict on the other hand, right? If there's no mountain or lake or something like that between the city of Babylon and the city of Shuruppak, or the city of Kish and the city of Nippur, or the city of Mosul and the city of Nineveh here, for instance, then it's easy for armies to travel overland or to take boats on the river and attack their neighbors. This was an area that did not lend itself to conquest by large empires. In the 24th century BCE, there was a brief empire based down here in Sumer, organized, conquered by a guy named Sargon the Great, but it only lasted for a half century or so. Later on in the 18th century BCE, from Babylon, a guy named Hammurabi, who we'll talk about later in the course, conquered most of Mesopotamia, but again, his empire did not last beyond about a century. Right? For the most part, ancient Mesopotamia consisted of these independent city-states who were constantly at war and also constantly trading with each other. There are a number of languages that we can detect in this place. Many of them are Semitic languages. In other words, they're related linguistically to languages like Hebrew and Arabic. But there are other languages in the area that are not Semitic, that in fact belong to their own language family that is far removed from Semitic. The Sumerian language of the area right around the Persian Gulf here was not Semitic. In fact, I'm not even sure that there is another language that's detected from the ancient world that has been compared to it or that is related to it. That meant that it's likely that different groups over time immigrated into this area and again found themselves in conflict and in trade with each other. So that aura of instability that pervaded Mesopotamia is also important to account for, and also contributes to the generally pessimistic, worried outlook that the people of Mesopotamia have. One of the ways that this pessimistic outlook manifests itself is in their religion. And we'll read some texts later in the course, in a couple of classes, that get into some of this, but we can detect their opinions about their gods from these texts. The gods tend to be these vengeful, capricious, unpredictable characters, much like the rivers were unpredictable. The gods are not beings that the people of Mesopotamia were willing to cross, and they lived in fear of their gods. These are not the benevolent gods like we see in some parts of the Judeo-Christian tradition, though not entirely. Depending on which book of the Bible we're looking at, or which part of the Bible, I suppose. But these gods were almost invariably unpredictable and mean, right? Okay, so that's Mesopotamia. Now, the other thing that we should note about this, a really important point, is that all of that atmosphere of threat and of chaos, this unpredictable environment they lived in, did force the Mesopotamians to innovate. They had to in order to survive. So we see a number of innovations in things like trade, in warfare, and one of the most important is in irrigation. The irrigation system developed by the ancient Mesopotamians has persisted for thousands of years at this point. Some parts of it are still in use. This was their means of, one, getting water from the Tigris and Euphrates to land that was in some cases, dozens or hundreds of miles distant from the rivers. That's the first purpose of it, but also to try to mitigate the effects of the flood. And so they created things like runoff channels, where if they saw a flood coming, they could divert the river into places where it wasn't going to destroy their crops or their homes. And so they came up with ways of dealing with this. The natural deck was stacked against them to some extent. The rivers themselves are high in salt content, so the more they irrigated, the higher the salt content in the soil became, and the less and less fertile it became. And so this has been one of the challenges of Mesopotamian history for the last 6,000 or 7,000 years, probably. Okay, let's now compare Mesopotamia to the other really early ancient civilization in the Near East, and that is Egypt. As this satellite photo indicates, Egypt is a very lush and fertile area only in this very limited place right along the Nile River until it gets to the Delta region, where the river fans out into various channels, and this whole area is fairly fertile, though also in places quite swampy and difficult to navigate. That satellite photo shows, I think, how fertile this place is. I mean, the emerald green ribbon you see there is pretty important, right? That's a pretty profound message from space about how lush that place is. Now, the Nile River, like the Tigris and Euphrates for Mesopotamia, the Nile River was for Egypt its lifeblood. However, unlike the Tigris and the Euphrates, the Nile was predictable. It flooded but it did so at the same time every year. They could almost set their watch to it. It was that predictable. The floods come from monsoon rains that hit equatorial Africa down here, the Horn of Africa, where the origin of the Blue Nile is, and down into the Great Lakes region of Africa down here. Get these monsoon rains. These are the same phenomenon we see in Southeast Asia and India and places like that. It's all part of the Indian Ocean atmosphere, and so they get these monsoon rains, and those rains cause the Nile to flood. That flows down the river, and by down we mean north. Okay, I'm going up on the slide here, but really that's down the river. And it overflows its banks and dumps this nice, fertile silt all over the land around it. The land down here in equatorial Africa much of it comes from this geographic feature called the Great Rift Valley, which is this deep fissure in the earth, and so the earth itself is from deep inside, and it's very fertile. Some of the most fertile soil in the world is in that region, and that soil is carried down the Nile and overflows its banks. So every year, the Nile Valley gets a new coat of incredibly fertile soil. The soil, unlike the soil in Mesopotamia, did not increase in salt content, and so, this could have continued forever. For literally thousands of years, until the building of the Aswan Dam in the 20th century by the Egyptian government, helped out by the Soviet Union, the Nile River flooded every single year predictably. There may have been some periods of drought that led to political instability, but probably not so much. That's one really important geographic feature. In fact, the single most important geographic feature. But there are others. Two others of note are the deserts that surround the Nile. The desert over here on the Sinai Peninsula is extremely dry, rocky, mountainous, foreboding, difficult to traverse. And so getting from the Fertile Crescent up here, which you can see just the tip of, down through the Sinai into the Nile Valley was not easy. Getting from the Red Sea across the eastern desert to the Nile Valley was similarly difficult. And then, of course, out here we have the Sahara Desert. Now, what all this amounts to is that Egypt was isolated from any sort of threat. Even to the south, there were a series of rapids, places where the river gets very swift and unnavigable, which meant that the people down here in the south, in this region called Nubia, did not often come into the lower Nile Valley to threaten the people there. Another feature is that the prevailing winds in Egypt blow north to south, which means that the river becomes even more navigable. The Nile is not a swift raging river for at least most of its lower course here. And because the winds are blowing north to south, if somebody wants to sail up the river, and by up we mean south, they simply put up a sail or something like that, and the wind carries them. If they want to float down the river, they just take down the sail, and the Nile carries them on this nice leisurely course down the Nile. So all of these geographic and climatic features produce in Egypt a society that is incredibly stable. Arguably the most stable, static society that the world has ever witnessed. For fully 2,000 years, through 30-plus dynasties of pharaohs, the Egyptian political system functioned without much change. Even with the passage from one dynasty to another, if a dynasty died out without heirs, was rarely fraught with any kind of conflict, at least no widespread conflict. There were some periods of conflict. One period called the Second Intermediate Period, there seems to have been an invasion from the Fertile Crescent into Egypt. A group with superior military technology, specifically chariots, made it into Egypt. But those periods, those kinds of events were few and far between. For the most part, the Egyptians lived in unbroken peace and stability. The ruler of Egypt in the ancient world was called the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh was a divine king. He claimed to be God on earth. And one of the things that we should ask about that is, how could somebody get away with something so audacious as to claim divinity? Well, it makes sense that if the region that he rules over is so predictable and productive that there is little reason for conflict, that somebody could lay claim to that kind of title. And particularly if the Pharaoh could take credit for producing the Nile flood. And you can see how this could happen. I mean, if you can predict the Nile flood, it's easy to predict. It happens the same time every year. He can say, I'm going to make it flood now, and then the Nile would flood now, and everybody believes that the Pharaoh is responsible for this, right? From about 27 or 2800 BCE, with some antecedents before that, to about 1100 or 1000 BCE, so nearly 2000 years, Egypt was ruled in an unbroken succession by pharaohs. Even the Semitic group called the Hyksos, who invaded Egypt in the 18th or 19th century BCE, quickly assimilated and took up positions as pharaohs until they were overthrown by a native dynasty. So you can see the appeal of this, right? Moreover, the pharaoh was not the only figure who was revered and admired. All of the Egyptian gods, they, like the Mesopotamians, had a pantheon of gods associated with various forces of nature. These gods, unlike the gods of ancient Mesopotamia, were viewed as benevolent, as good, as, in fact, beings who loved humans and wanted to bless their lives with all good things. Now, we'll look at some evidence of this in some of the texts that we'll discuss in a couple of class periods. The Egyptians, moreover, felt, because of all of these geographic advantages, that they were the most blessed of all the peoples of the earth, that they were better than everyone else. The Egyptians had a superiority complex a mile wide, right? Now, if there are disadvantages to this, and I don't want to overemphasize this, because after all, the Egyptians lived in almost complete stability for 2,000 years. There is no other civilization that has lasted that long in unbroken fashion. But if there were problems with this, it's that the Egyptians had no need to innovate, unlike the Mesopotamians, who had to produce new military technology and agricultural technology and naval technology and things like this in order to survive. The Egyptians had really no need to do this. Some of their greatest accomplishments happened very early in the Pharaonic period. The building of the Great Pyramid, for instance, the Great Pyramid of Khufu or Cheops, was done by a third dynasty pharaoh in the 27th century BCE. That was never equaled, at least in size, right? Many other pharaohs did produce great monuments, but no one really approached that again. And so it might, in fact, be that the earliest pharaohs were the most successful and most innovative of all of them, because after that there really was no need for it. Now, the one exception to this probably would be the New Kingdom period pharaohs, running from about the 16th or 17th century BCE to about the 11th or 12th century BCE. They, for the first time in Egyptian history, ventured outside of the Nile Valley and attempted to conquer other lands. Most pharaohs before this had been content. There may have been some raids into Nubia or someplace like that. But the New Kingdom pharaohs went well beyond the borders of Egypt, up into the Fertile Crescent, conquering parts of the Levant up here on the other side of the Sinai Peninsula. Before that, the Egyptians didn't have an army. In the Old and Middle Kingdom periods, there was no army to speak of, except maybe an ad hoc thing. There was no need for it. They didn't need to defend themselves from any outside invasions because none of them were ever coming, right? So a sharp contrast between these two societies, and one that we should consider, emphasize, analyze by looking at some evidence. Here's a good illustration from the ancient world of the Nile flood going on. Now, a few pieces of evidence, and later on we'll cover some textual evidence about these things. But one piece of evidence here is the writing system of the two respective civilizations. Both of them did produce writing systems. Now, we should not say written language because neither the writing system of the Mesopotamians nor the writing system of the Egyptians were phonetic. And by that we mean a system where the symbols indicate sounds. The ancient Mesopotamian writing system was called cuneiform. It is a logographic system. That is, there are these abstract shapes that form combinations, and those combinations together form characters that represent ideas or sets of ideas. They are not meant to be pictographic or direct representations or even symbolic metaphorical representations of things. The symbols themselves are representations of ideas, but not tied to the way that it looks necessarily. It's more the combination of these things. Cuneiform was produced by on clay tablets, and so these were wet when the documents were written. They were then impressed with these wedge characters using a reed that grew along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It was cut into a nib and pressed into the wet mud. You can see that it is scored here or ruled, much like your notebook paper is ruled. This was ruled, and so each one of these lines is a specific entry. Now let's look at the document on the right here. Even though none of you likely can read cuneiform, it's a devilishly hard writing system to master. I don't read cuneiform either. I do have a good friend who is a scholar of cuneiform, and I saw to some extent what he had to go through to learn that language. I knew him when he was in grad school. But even though none of us read this language or this writing system, I'm still willing to bet that you can look at that and probably figure out what's going on. Something you might notice that there are these rows and there are also columns, right? This seems to be a column of entries. This is a column of entries. This is a column of entries. And this may be something familiar to you. It looks like a spreadsheet. It looks like an Excel document written in cuneiform. And that seems to be what this is. This is an inventory of some kind, an accounting record, something to keep track of trade. The vast majority of these cuneiform documents written on clay tablets, and there are thousands of these that have been dug up out of the area of Mesopotamia, the vast majority of them are rather mundane records of trade. Why is that the case? Well, a few things that we might point out here. The Mesopotamians lived in a hostile environment and thrived only if they could trade or fight. And keeping inventories and records like this were important for both purposes. If you're involved in a chaotic thing like a war, well, you might want to keep an inventory of your things so that you know what you have. In case you're separated from those things, there might be some, keeping an inventory might be a way of keeping track of sort of far-flung enterprises. With trade, of course, you want to have some record of the transactions so that you keep track of how much money you've made, how much inventory you still have, and everything like that. There are a few examples of works of literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, for instance, that were written in cuneiform. The one on the left here is a tablet, I believe, of the Epic of Gilgamesh, this famous myth from the 3rd millennium BCE. But most of them are these mundane records of trade or inventories, things like that. Accounting documents, really. So the writing system itself is fitting for the civilization, is reflective of the civilization that produced it. The other thing about cuneiform is that it didn't matter which language a person actually spoke. If they mastered the characters, they could read the language. And so this is fitting for an area that had many different languages. It allowed for people involved in trade with each other to communicate via written documents. Now let's compare that to hieroglyphics. This is I mean, these are a few characters. This is not a practical writing system. This is pictographic, so the pictures represent either literal or metaphorical things. Really what you're looking at is a form of art, a form of keeping records that was artistic. This was almost entirely the property of the elites, particularly the pharaohs and the priests of religious cults and things like that. This was a writing system that was used to tell stories, to write down the accomplishments of the pharaoh, or to tell mythological stories about the gods, or something like that. It was not a thing that merchants or farmers would use to keep track of things, right? They didn't have access to this. So the respective writing systems indicate the stark differences between the two civilizations. One final piece of evidence to note the contrast between these two civilizations is monumental architecture. By monumental architecture, we mean things that are bigger than just mundane utilitarian buildings, right? For the most part in the ancient world, monumental architecture was produced for two reasons. One of them is political, that is, as a statement of political power or political authority. The other is religious, that is, as a statement of belief or of deference to a deity. And in many cases, these were one and the same, because the pharaoh was, of course, both king and god. The great tombs of the Old Kingdom pharaohs here, the Great Pyramid of Giza, served simultaneously a political and religious purpose. Now this was the same in Mesopotamia. The famous ziggurats up here, this is an example, even look similar to the pyramids. And so we might note the commonality among these two civilizations. However, if we look at the motivations for building these, there seems to, and the manner by which they were built, there is on display a fairly stark difference. Mesopotamians built these buildings out of fear. Fear of their rulers, who exerted tremendous control over them and enslaved large parts of the population. These buildings were probably produced largely by slave labor from war captives and people like that, and out of fear of their gods. Whereas the pyramids were not produced by slave labor. The Egyptians didn't have many slaves. Slaves came, again, primarily from taking war captives. The Egyptians didn't tend to fight too many wars because they didn't need to. These pyramids were built by conscripted peasant labor. And the peasants seem to have been willing to do this. I mean, it's an absolutely gargantuan structure, right? The Great Pyramid is something like 150 meters on a side. It's huge. The largest single masonry structure still ever built by human hands, but it was done by people who, again, were conscripted and seem to have done so willingly, right? So there's some real differences here. Even though the buildings look similar and they're used for similar purposes, there are differences in the reasons for their production and the way they themselves were produced. So let's consider the differences between those two civilizations, and we will look in future classes at some textual and other evidence for to examine these further.